the idea is to have short statements of 5-6 minutes, and then maybe a round of comments to the other statements, and then we'll go into the public debate, questions, comments from you, and then a final round on the look forward to the next 30 years. So let me start maybe with Hannes Swoboda. So the fall of the Berlin Wall was obviously a political watershed event. How did you experience it as a politician of the time? And what is your assessment? How did all of this change the European Union at the time?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation and thank you for coming. I'm really surprised that so many people, and this speaks for the Institute, so many people come after so many events already in this week. As you mentioned, I was still in the city of Vienna, and of course we thought that for Vienna it would be, the future development, totally different from declining population to growing population. We had at that time a study made, and people came to me, I was responsible, and asked, well, we have a scenario, we call it Sao Paulo scenario, but we cannot use that word because it's too much people would come. But if you look, many more people came, not only from the region, we thought, but from many other countries as well. Then in the European Union, I was for all the time, 18 years in the European Parliament in the Foreign Affairs Committee, which was responsible for giving advice to the Parliament to decide on membership or not, because any new member has to be decided also by the European Parliament. The real problem, which was, what are the conditions of enlargement, or what were the conditions? The so-called Copenhagen criteria. One mistake probably was that we concentrated too much on the Copenhagen criteria, but not looking at the economic, but especially the social element and the balanced development. Already was shown the question of migration. Migration was only discussed on the way freedom of movement for labor, and we in Austria have been often criticized that we are too restrictive. We had these transition periods, but never was a discussion about what would happen if really the people would move, and what would it mean for the countries and the regions people move out of it. This was not the question. Second element was, of course, the enlargement took place in the time of a neoliberal deregulatory economic policies worldwide, but also in Europe. But when I now meet some people, some experts, especially from the Eastern countries, say, you enforced on us a neoliberal model, it's not quite true. Because when we raised the issue of social elements in the economic development, the answer was, okay, you want to keep your privileges. We want now the real economic liberal model. We don't want new regulations. We have enough of regulations in the past. We want to be free and decide what we want. When we discussed, for example, labor legislation in the European Parliament, the Services Directive, issues of working time hours for truck drivers and so on, it was always, or mostly it was, we got the answer, don't overregulate. We want our truck drivers to go into your country and don't keep your privileges. So this kind of model, which shows the deficiencies now, was, of course, implemented and was the wish of Western capitalists, whatever you want to say, but it was also the wish of at least the leading class in the new member countries, to be new member countries, who were eager to show that the communist past is over, socialist and social democratic policies are not really what they want. They want real freedom. They want shock therapies and other things. And this, of course, I think is the major problem. I did not yet read the essays, but you did tell us so few that we have to read them. So that's, and I'm really interested what the experts think, but this is my experience. That from both sides, not that we were not prepared. As I read today in Le Monde, even Gorbachev and others, everybody said we were not prepared for it. But we were in the streamline of neoliberal thinking. If accession would have taken place 15 years before, when there was still social market economy, was still popular, probably it would have been different. But this is what happened, and I think we have now to consolidate it in a different form. And the last remark, the question is, if we see illiberal democracy, so-called illiberal democracy, and other elements, they are closely connected with these economic and with these deficiencies and with this emigration. You cannot answer this emigration with, okay, we have migrants anyway in Europe, because then it's a double provocation. Now our good people leave, and you send us other people who are not qualified and from other cultural hemispheres. So this is not an answer to it. We have to find new answers how a circular migration can take place, that the concept of circular migration was not active brought into the whole debate, I think, has been a mistake. But this involves West and East, because you see the illiberal developments you have in eastern part and the western part. In the western part, we have a longer time of democratic patterns, therefore the negative effect is not so strong. But de facto, there is a growing together happening and happened, but it was a growing together very often on a wrong, from my point of view, basis. Too much neoliberal politics, not enough social cushions for it, undermining of democratic patterns and behavior. So I think we have to change. Maybe in a second round we can say about the future. We have to change things not only in the East. We have to have a European policy which is given an answer to the deficiencies in the West and the East, which are finally not so much different. Even if in one element it's more the emigration, which is a problem, and in others maybe it's more the immigration, which is seen as a problem. But the migration issue in general, I think, and we will perhaps have some answers from some experts here, is a big issue economically, maybe less, but psychologically and socially and culturally, it is a big issue, and we have to have a common framework for that, for the East and the West.
Thank you very much. Philipp Ther, as Hannes Swoboda suggests, 1989 marked also an ideological end of an era. So what is the longer run historical dimension of that year for Europe as a whole? And do we currently experience another paradigm shift maybe?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you as well for the invitation. I'm very glad to be back here and to be in contact with economists. Now, I'm mostly a social historian, and sometimes I try to add up things. But nevertheless, let me start directly in response to your question. I think, looking back, we need to distinguish between what I perceive as the democratic revolution and the fall of '89, what then soon became with Hannah Arendt, constitutional and liberal, and then neoliberal revolution. And I would absolutely agree that there were, so to say, homegrown actors who supported this view. It was not an octroi, but there were parts of the elites who went for that. And so if you look back, then actually we didn't arrive yet at this moment in terms of an anniversary, but this moment will be the spring and summer of 1990, when we got this neoliberal turn in the region, in the larger region. Of course, also in the very late Soviet Union, and then in Russia. A second brief comment, that is more of a global perspective. Well, if you look at the Western perception, which was, of course, always in contact, and there were feedback processes, and we look back on the famous end of history, I don't want to do Fukuyama bashing, but anyway, what is interesting is that it is a clear expression of, first of all, Western triumphalism, I mean, read the essay, you can access it on the internet, even more so than the book. And it also celebrates very much the victory of conservative parties and, you know, the removal not just of socialism, but of the homegrown moderate left, who are also kind of put on the, you know, dustbin of history. Now, at the same time, there was the Washington Consensus, you all in here economists know about it, of course. Now, there was a dispute by the very author of the Washington Consensus, how was it meant, was it neoliberal, which doesn't exist, and so on in 2004. He wrote that. Anyway, it gave kind of a blueprint, and again, I think it is important to look at the feedback effects from what was implemented and then even celebrated as success stories in the East, and how that reverberated in the West. And, you know, I think a fine example, if you want to take an already historical source, take the Treisman-Schleifer article in 2014, still celebrating the shock therapy. I would dispute that there's a direct causal correlation between shock and then growth. It's much more complicated. You know, one could come back, by the way, to the case of Ukraine, and this comparison with Poland, that's of course misguided. Geography, timing. These two more historical factors, of course, make it in a way very dissimilar, and one would have to be very careful in a comparative design to then, you know, to put these stories on parallel terms. Now, your question was about more recent economic and above all political changes. I mean, there's obviously the moment of the crisis, the global crisis, which I think removes the clear goal where and what to transform to. Transformation, understood by Fukuyama, but also if you then take Jeffrey Sachs, double transition and so on, had a clear goal, westernization, and there was a fairly clear picture what the West would like, what would be. Of course, rather American-British model of the West. And I think the result of the crisis is that this model got kind of lost, now even more so. And I think this explains a lot of now the, if we want to put it in old-fashioned terms, counter-revolutionary activities in the post-socialist countries. According to Karl Polanyi, whom I reread in the past year and found inspiring, well, obviously he puts up his theory about in the Great Transformation that too much of global laissez-faire capitalism, which I think in post-89 terms we can translate as global neoliberalism, creates counter-reactions. Then, of course, he leaves it open where the pendulum swings, whether to democratic socialism, what he was hoping for, or authoritarian or fascist regimes, what he went through in his lifetime. Now, history does not repeat itself, or if so, according, of course, to Marx, it's a farce. But I mean, the pendulum, after 2009, there was a little swing towards the left. We can see it in, you know, some election results, maybe also in the rise of left-wing populists. But then it clearly swung to the right. And now, however, where did it swing to the right? 2015, Poland. Now, there's also coincidental factors in their election laws, who got into parliament and so on. So it's, you know, I wouldn't say it was predetermined that peace would win an absolute majority, but there's already the beginning of this pendulum swing, and Poland in many ways was a pioneer once more. Then obviously Brexit and Trump. And now why, you know, these kind of say, you know, throughout the West, these anti-reactions, because obviously some features of post-socialist transformation also hit the West as a result of globalization. And maybe also the roots are in some ways comparable. If we take the teleologically understood post-89 transformation as a late version of a modernization model, or maybe even ideology, then I think one can find parallels to the, so to say, pro-globalization argument. Now, I don't want to dispute every detail of that, but seemingly one could also draw another comparison, not just in the ideological foundations, but then also in the social results. Now, I don't know, I think I've used my 5 minutes, so maybe I should, did I? I don't know. Not yet, okay. Maybe I should stop, but maybe one, so, you know, with all these illiberal tendencies, it's not a real ism. You know, we would overrate also the Orban speech, where he used illiberal, to call it an ism, but in certain ways it was an anti-reaction, filling the void after the loss of the original telos of the transformation. But I think one can also see certain, and politically, of course, in terms of electorate, it is in parts an anti-reaction, a very strong one. But I think one can also see certain continuities. One, I think, is the enmity towards critical political discourse. I mean, first you have there's no alternative, and then you get the discourse about fake news, which is, of course, very distant from original liberalism, which used to like public or semi-public deliberation. And then I think there's another continuity still, which is condescendence for, lower classes, which were termed as either losers of transformation, white trash, Harzer. And so I think there's also a very dangerous continuity there. Okay, with that I'm ending.
Thank you very much. You should have your own mics. I think Martin Kahanec, Philipp Ther mentioned it. There have been quite some social issues related, obviously, to the structural change following the end of the central planning, and that has massive influence on labor markets, demographics, and migration. So from a public policy point of view, how does this affect also current politics in the region?
Yeah, thank you very much. I trust you can hear me. The mic, I guess, is working. Thanks very much for having me here. It's a great privilege to be part of this panel. And it's also very personal, kind of, you know, it's an opportunity for me to share with you some kind of personal experiences. I was 12 when the wall collapsed, and so I could live through this period. Yes, I had these experiences as a secondary school student, then university, and then migrating, my own migration project, going around in Europe, living a bit in the east, in the west, and observing the discourses. Yes, observing the discourses, observing the changes. And if I look back 30 years, what I see, what I remember very vividly is being very keen on what's going on. As I was just 12, but I still was sitting on the TV set and looking, what is this, discussing this. Actually, at the elementary school, kids were discussing this every day. Micro. And
how to make a?
It is here. I mean, it should be working. I bring it a bit closer here. Maybe that will help, or I do the double thing here. Okay, so I do remember this very vividly, and the key terms discussed back then was freedom, democracy, market economy, transformation, transition. And what you could see, what you could observe afterwards was a discussion how to do this, and various pathways. The shock therapy, you remember this gradualism and all kinds of mixed strategies, and then some countries backslided or reverted the reforms. And you can see various developments. But the one kind of, what I recall as one key element in this was that people went through difficult times. Yes, this was unemployment, people feared losing their jobs. And this brings me to the social policy and to the labor market issues. So people lost their jobs. There was transformation. The welfare state was in. I mean, one could say that it partly disintegrated, but there was still some welfare state, some provisions. So. in any case, this was a transformation that was costly, and the psychology of that transformation was very difficult after many years, because when you think about the population, these currently alive in these countries, these people were much younger back then. They maybe were unborn or they were children, and when they nowadays recall those times and times before 1989, what they recall is actually not such a bad life. They were younger, they were better, and we know that there is the positive bias in the recall. They may remember less of inequality and certainly much less uncertainty. I mean, what was certain was maybe not so great, but it was at least some kind of standard. And the one big thing, when you look at the happiness, measures of happiness, is that happiness actually did not improve so much. Actually, it went down, and that's not so surprising because, of course, the point of reference shifted in 1989. Now, this is driving some of the developments also presently and currently that the democratic backsliding and the response to this is what it is. That there are challenges with respect to how public policy can be shaped in this context of people being left a little bit. After these countries joined the European Union and joined NATO, being left in a vacuum. And I explain what I mean by this vacuum. For many years, these countries and the kind of suffering I mentioned, the cause, that was seen as a prize, so to say, for transformation towards a better life, better quality of life, better future. And part of this was driven by the aspiration to come back to the family of Europe, the European family, yes, at least in Central Eastern Europe, or this where I come from, Slovakia or Czech Republic. This come back. But when this was achieved in some institutional sense in 2004, 2007, 2013, there was a bit of a vacuum, and there was no next dream, so to say, for these countries. Yes, there was no next big project. When we when there was another element to the transformation, which was what people realized after, with respect to that aspiration, becoming again European, returning to Europe, is the divide in the mental space. Yes, this is what they observed, and I give you a short story. A student of University of Vienna, sometimes in 2000, told me, "Well, look, I was a child. We went up to one of the hills, which had a view over back then Czechoslovakia. This was 1980 something." And I asked my mother, "What's over there, my mother?" And the answer was, "Well, da gibt's nichts. There's nothing." Yes, and this was so. This was the divide. Yes, this was the divide, and which is taking many years to overcome, and we have made great progress there. But this is also fueling some kind of maybe misunderstanding or not appreciation of each other. Sometimes in these debates, also when you look at the migration debate, and it's back to hopefully back a bit to your question. When you look at the migration debate, the context in which this question is discussed is very different from the East and West perspective. So labor markets, unemployment, restructuring, demography, what we see with respect to demography is that we have migration, mobility, east-west primarily, and that's of course is an issue of how we interpret this. We go to Riga 2007, and then the discussion is you're stealing our best brains and hands. You go there 2010 and say, please take them because we have no jobs for these people. So but several countries in Central Eastern Europe have been losing their skilled, qualified hands and brains, and that is a challenge for these countries. On the other hand, we have seen what this created, what kind of consequences that free mobility has had in receiving countries. And we have aging, we have educational system which have not been, health and education are those sectors which have not been transformed very well in the Central Eastern Europe, which have been left behind because of the priorities which were seen as in different parts of public policy, where the difficulty or the challenges were, okay, we have to deal with the monetary policy, fiscal policy, trade and several other privatization and all those other fields. So some of those related more directly to labor markets and human capital management in the Central Eastern Europe have been ignored or not adequately addressed. So I hope I gave you some kind of reminiscences or some kind of points reflecting your question, but maybe I leave the rest for further questions. How different policies have been shaped and how they can be further developed.
Thank you very much. Julia Wörz, now maybe moving a bit away from the so-called real economy, one could obviously observe that transition also meant a massive change in the monetary and financial system of the region. And while more recently some countries actually adopted the euro, others didn't. So from a central bank perspective, what are the experiences of different approaches?
Well, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a great honor and pleasure to be here and to discuss with these panelists together this, I would say, celebration of the 30 years of transition. You are right, Mario, that of course the approaches with respect to financial sector transformation have differed greatly, but probably more than the outcomes that we see now. So I would like, of course, knowing that I'm also talking to an audience that knows the region, so you all know about the heterogeneities and particularities of all the countries, but I would still like to point a little bit to the common characteristics that we have seen over the transition and that we see now. So when we talk about the banking sectors, in fact, banking sectors are either characterized by a strong dominance of foreign banks, or further in the east, in Russia, Ukraine, also Belarus, by state-owned banks. So we have sort of two regimes here, if you want to put it that way. And turning to these more foreign bank-dominated banking sectors, so clearly the early entry, or in some cases also later entry of the foreign banks has supported the restructuring not only of the banking sectors themselves, but also to provide financing, and that's really what the banking sectors are here for. And so they played an important role in financing the catching up of those economies. Not only made they themselves up a large part of the FDI that went into those countries, but also they helped to foster or channel FDI into other sectors of the economy. So in that sense, this was probably a unifying characteristics of many of the countries in the region. On the downside, of course, foreign bank presence also implied some risks and vulnerabilities. For instance, we had strong credit growth, often above deposit growth, which was enabled by the parent bank funding also. But there was also reliance coming from that on foreign funding and the building up of high stocks of FX credits in the region. Of course, today these issues are not the biggest concern anymore in those banking sectors. Even the funding structure has really changed quite notably towards more local deposits. And I would also like to mention the Austrian sustainability package that was introduced in 2012 that also helped or supported this change in the funding structure of the banks. And the FX problems were, of course, very apparent right after the global financial crisis and were addressed by the governments, by the host government or the local governments, we all know, and maybe we can discuss later, that a lot of issues remain here in this respect with how these FX stocks were built down or were resolved. So there were, again, very different approaches to doing that. But overall, this is not so much the big issue today. Let me just briefly turn to the state-owned bank-dominated countries. So here you could say that probably this implies a less efficient banking sectors. Those banks are clearly not so much profit-oriented, although there are exceptions. The biggest bank in the region, Sberbank, is actually quite a profitable bank and quite an efficiently managed bank by Hermann Gref. He has run the bank pretty well for quite some time now. And also in these banking sectors, connected lending will often become a problem. But on the other hand, you could also find a positive side here, as state owners since they are not so much profit-oriented, they can also calm the situation in a crisis, and they can always, I mean, almost no need to bail out the bank, but they will always do so. Now, with respect to exchange rate or monetary policy regimes, again, here the region has started with a great variety of regimes and different shades of different regimes. There were also some policy changes or stop and go over the time. But all in all, it has sort of moved towards a dichotomy again. We have hard packs on the one hand, predominantly smaller countries, and we have mostly managed floaters who, most of them adopted inflation targeting. So, of course, the floaters also kept control on their exchange rates via FX interventions to deal with problems that are very typical to emerging economies, such as excessive capital flows or associated exchange rate volatility. The point, in our view, of which exchange rate regime you adopt is probably overstressed a lot, and there is also some, literature showing this, or at least the central bank, and I know Peter Paquet is here, but I don't see him, but they have published, even years ago, that actually it's not so much a question of which exchange rate regime you adopt, it's rather the question of the stability-oriented policies or a coherent policy mix that actually counts. I could mention the example of Slovenia here. Slovenia has even adopted the euro, but the euro per se is not a panacea to avoid all problems. We have witnessed a banking crisis not so long ago in Slovenia and a big recession. Although in defense of the euro, I would also like to ask, so what would have happened had Slovenia not adopted the euro at the time? Because the euro clearly avoided a currency crisis and it allowed access to the ECB liquidity to help the banks to stay afloat. So in that sense, it's not so much the exchange rate regime per se, the approach you choose here, but it's the whole package of monetary policies, accompanying policies, stabilization-oriented policies, and all these, of course, have to rest on a sound institutional and governance structure. And this is probably the issue where most still needs to be done. So, but I'm sure this will be part of the discussion, but that the biggest room for improvement is clearly in this sphere. Finally, let me turn to macro-prudential measures, and here maybe as a lesson from the experience from boom-bust cycles that these countries have gone through, they have really learned the hard way how important it is to tame the cycle. And therefore, many of the countries, of the transition countries, have adopted macro-prudential measures very early on. So they have expanded their monetary policy toolkit even way before Western European countries or other advanced economies did so. And in this sense, much like many other emerging economies, the countries have actually even moved ahead of the theory that was still discussing what is the target of the central bank and is it the price stability only or the macro financial stability as well. And so they've just moved ahead using those measures, implementing them. Poland has started very early on. So in that sense, and this brings me to what you mentioned, that there was this victory of the West, and we know it better, and you have to adopt our approaches. This is still very much in the head of the people, in my view, and much more than it's actually justified, because we can also learn a lot from the approaches and the experiences that the countries made during their transition. Just to summarize, so of course, I mentioned that banking sectors are in much better shape now. The FX problem is not there anymore to the extent we had it, and NPLs have also gone down, also thanks to the Vienna initiative. Capitalization of the banking sector has also strengthened, and the refinancing structure has changed towards more stable local funding and deposit funding. But of course, we do see also risks, so looking a little bit forward. And you have also mentioned one of the risks that we also witness very closely, which is in certain segments, for instance, housing. And this is actually interesting. Of course, so we have a quite impressive high growth of housing prices in many countries. We have also a strong increase in lending in the housing sector. We also have in some countries, and this is also a concern, strong increase in unsecured consumer lending. In some cases, even this is to circumvent, again, the macroprudential measures that are put in place to control the rise in housing credits are sometimes circumvented by going through consumer lending. Yeah? So there is a lot here where we closely look at, and which you also mentioned in the recent forecast as one of the risks. And also as a risk, the very accommodative monetary policy, not only in the countries, but also the conditions that they face, because of course they're very influenced by foreign conditions, euro area conditions as well, means that at the moment we have historically low interest rates, so it all looks good, but we have to see what happens when those interests eventually start to rise again. Let me just turn back a little bit to the catching up. I think the big question for the future will be how to finance the future growth. And it will probably be less foreign finance through FDI. The banking financing model is probably also not the one that is the only, should be the only game in town to finance it. And here clearly there is also a lot of room again for more reform, more transformation, building local or domestic capital markets, and a whole lot. I don't know if it's been mentioned, but fintechs and all these role of the shadow banking sector also. I think there we will see a lot of change and interesting. I mean, transition is never over, probably. So it's there. We are always in a state of transition to new states.
That's true. Thank you very much, Peter Havlik. And now you have been dealing with. I think you have to turn it on first. You have been dealing both with the Czech Republic as well as with Russia as an economist, and you have been witness of extremely different outcomes over the last 30 years. So, what are the lessons you have learned, also from a personal perspective?
Thank you, Mario. Thank you for inviting me to this panel.
I think you have to speak very close.
Let me start perhaps with a little correction to your introduction, because I've been working on Czechoslovak economy and on the Soviet economy in 1989. And indeed, this is one of the biggest surprises. From the benefit of hindsight, we perhaps do not appreciate it very much. But in 1989, hardly anybody would imagine that instead of Czechoslovakia, Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, we would have 27 independent states. So this is just a small introductory remark. I would make a few brief points, basically focusing on some personal experience. I am probably the oldest person on this panel. And I came to Vienna in 1980 as a dissident. with 2 coffers. In one coffer I had books, in the second coffer I had some clothing. So that was all. And in 1989 I was as unprepared as anybody else that these changes will occur. And indeed, I again would like to illustrate this with some personal reflections. At the end of October 1989, Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, at that time it has been called Vienna Institute for Comparative Economic Studies, we have invited a certain Václav Klaus to have a lecture in October 1989. He gave a lecture at our institute, and well, one of the questions which I posed to him was, what do you think, what will the Czechoslovak economy look like in near future? And he talked during the lecture about the reform of socialist enterprises and how these enterprises have already adjusted to the new conditions. And Professor Lasky, at that time the director of the institute, asked him, even on the TV, that whether some kind of reform and privatization would be also perhaps useful in Czechoslovak economy. And Klaus said at that time, October 1989, he said, no, privatization is not necessary. Czechoslovak socialist enterprises have already adjusted to market conditions. So this is just an illustration. Another illustration, as you perhaps have heard, Mrs. Angela Merkel, on the evening when Berlin Wall fell, was in the sauna. And she didn't bother to go to West Berlin as many others. Yeah? So this is just, again, something very interesting. Then the next point which I wanted to raise is that there has been these discussions, shock therapy, gradualism, mentioned already by previous speakers. The Vienna Institute for Comparative Economic Studies has been very much engaged in these discussions, and we basically opted at that time for more gradual approach. We had even some heated discussions with the IMF, which argued for Washington consensus and rapid liberalization, privatization, and so on. And we had experience and contact with many economists from Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and at that time we were convinced that probably this gradual transition, especially in terms of privatization, but other aspects of reform as well, would be perhaps better. Then, as far as the Soviet economic reforms and transition are concerned, again we had a lot of contact with the Soviet economists, and I just want to point out, again, probably many people do not remember, but there were certain people like Mr. Yeltsin and Mr. Gorbachev who appointed a reform commission at the end of 1989 to elaborate reform of the Soviet economy, a plan. What came out was a so-called 500 days reform plan elaborated by Professor Shatalin from the Soviet Economy of Sciences with a team, and they discussed this plan also at our institute in early 1990. What is interesting is what happened with many proponents of transition. So they made a very different careers. Like, for example, in the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus became first finance minister, then prime minister, then president, and so on. His colleague, Miloš Zeman, from the same Institute of Forecasting, was minister, then he was, and he still is president, and so on. In the Soviet Union, some people went to business and made a lot of money. Like, for instance, Peter Aven, who heads, by the way, one of the biggest Russian banks, Alpha Bank, and he is now worth probably about $6 to $7 billion. So this is one example. The other example, proponent of privatization, Mr. Chubais, went to government, was responsible for the voucher privatization and so on. Other ones, like Mr. Ilarionov, who served as an advisor even to President Putin, is now a very big, I would say, dissident working in United States, disputing very much the current economic and political situation. So this shows how people have different views and experiences, including myself. My experiences were also very diverse and different. I just wanted to finish my brief presentation by pointing out at the examples of two books which we wrote in 1989, 1990. One is this one, Economic Reforms in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. This was published in 1988. At that time, still practically everybody believed that there will be economic reforms within the system. 3 years ago, in 1991, or the articles were drafted in 1990, the talk was already about dismantling the command economy. I edited the volume, and some quotations from this book, from the introduction which I wrote for this book, are quoted in these personal reflections, so I invite anybody who is interested to read it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. So would you maybe want to react to each other's statements very briefly? Yeah.
Very briefly, only two remarks. The first is, the question is, was there an alternative development possible? And of course, there is always one. Tina is, there is no alternative, is always wrong. But I think the situation, if you look how people saw it from the East and West, and they could meet on this neoliberal strategy, in spite of the discussion, what you just mentioned, you had at the Institute, which is to the honor of the Institute. I doubt that the radical alternative was possible at that time, if you see the factual situation. And the second element, of course, is I think we still have a dividing line in Europe, and that perhaps goes to the future. We still speak about the West and the East. We have not yet arrived at an economic, let's say, policy for all Europe. Because as it was Professor Attila Ag, who in a discussion in Vienna said recently, yes, we have also in the East, but you also could say we have in Italy an East which is in the South, and in some other areas as well. So I think we should move on the European level to what the Institute does very often, to an economic policy for the whole Europe, of course with diversity, but the differences you have inside the countries as well, and not look only the East is different from the West, because in some elements it's not so different. At least we need a policy which would overcome these kind of differences between the different Easts and the different Wests.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Okay, so we'll make a second round. Well, I mean, to you, I would have I'm not sure whether it's, I should pose the question to you, but anyhow, when you argued for a revamped kind of more social democratic policy, then of course, one could ask parts of social democracy in Germany or in Britain whether they are a part of the problem. Then, however,
The answer now, yes.
Yeah, of course. If we then, however, look at the anti-reaction, with Corbyn, then maybe the part of the problem can be bigger than the original problem. So I'm not sure, how the counter-reaction works and why. At the moment, it seems to be only, then a renationalized version of a reinvigorated left. I have a question to you because, just out of curiosity, because I know very little about it. Okay, if you now have kind of a new, how can one say, mix of policies, so basically a new kind of consensus of sound economic policies. How does that fit together with the political divergence, especially the new course taken by governments like Orban, who also have a very different agenda in terms of trying to nationalize the profits, and other maybe more heterodox approaches than we might think. Of course, the Polish government at the moment, it runs exactly the social policy we're arguing for. The social policy, 500 plus, the payments for families, for children, this is pretty much at the Austrian level of Familienbeihilfe. And of course, it means much more in purchasing power in Poland, creating by now rising inflation. But anyhow, is there really such a, how can one say, how can one factor in these, different political regimes? Are they already divergent on the economic policy level, or is it all one kind of, post 2009, rationalized, multi-element economic policy?
So I didn't want to say that there is a consensus on the right policies or so. But the point I wanted to make is that despite very different approaches, outcomes are actually relatively similar in some sense. But yes, on the one hand, what you mentioned, Polish social policy or social economic policy, and also Hungary is the same point in case, that this is actually, in some sense, you could say, yes, this is probably more leftish policy than what we have in other places. And it seems to be working if you just look at the GDP growth figures. They are always quite fine. I mean, we share, I think, the same view here in our forecast that for both countries, actually, policy-supported measures very much drive the growth or support the growth. Policy measures support the growth. Turning a little bit more to the financial sector, what we see here, of course, is a lot of, and this is post-global financial crisis, a lot more coordination, a lot more common European initiatives or European also regulation. And these countries are, the countries that are EU members are, of course, to varying degrees subject to those. So in that sense, there is probably a consensus, yes, that comes from the lessons that we learned, and that is already in the form of European coordination measures and regulation that we see here. But there is still, if you think of the financial stability side, it's completely national still. So here the countries do have their own way for maneuver, they have their own approaches, although also here it's of course, I would say better if coordination takes place, especially in the special case that we have this big interlinkages in the banking sectors with parents in other countries than the daughter banks. So in that sense, it makes sense to coordinate. But there are discussions. If you think of the discussions with the bail-in regime, there is still, I think, as far as I know, open which approaches the different countries will choose, and there are still discussions of what would be better, and sometimes you get the impression that the local supervisors want to a little bit move their problems as far away from their own home countries as possible. And in that sense, it's certainly very appreciated to have the new institutions that have been developed as a response to the crisis that allowed us to deepen the monetary union, like the SSM and so the parts of the banking union that are now already working for some years.
Okay, any other quick, very brief?
Do you go ahead, please?
Just perhaps a few remarks to what Mr. Swoboda said in his presentation. You started, I think, a little bit too late. You talked a lot about EU enlargement, but this came at least a decade after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I have to remember that there was not too much enthusiasm in the European Union about enlargement. There were even about this opening of the East. It lasted few months, you know, this enthusiasm. After a few months, there were a lot of reservations against these people coming from the East and doing some bad things and troubles and so on. I can remember it very well, also from my personal experience. Then the initial reaction of the Western policymakers regarding integration of these countries was, please create your own trading zone, because the accession to the European Union is in unforeseeable future, something what the EU is now promising for Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and Western Balkans. So this is something what I can very well remember. The very brief comment on what Mr. Ther said about the uncertain target of transition. Here I have to say that at least for Central and Eastern Europe, it was quite clear, you know, they wanted liberal democracy, market economy, return to Europe. This was the Central and Eastern Europe. In the Soviet Union, as I have also written in this book, the situation was quite unpredictable, and in fact, I wrote then that anything can happen, because these 15 republics were so much diverse that really it was unpredictable. So just these two quick comments. Thank you.
If I may, thank you very much. Now, when I'm asked about what the consequences for public policy have been, well, one answer could be, well, you know, the capacities have been built, and at the ministries, at public policy actors have developed, and you can observe in Slovakia now actually fantastic development, how public policy expertise is being, number one, built, and number two, put into practice and implemented, and it's actually very inspiring development. But I cannot avoid thinking about this big question, because I can see at the same time some positive developments, but they are very fragile with respect to the big question of democratic backsliding. And that's I think what's been already mentioned by several speakers. A very big role is played by this kind of, what I mentioned as well, is the kind of mental divide, and different interpretation of histories and different narratives about what happened and what was going on. Now, the one thing, the one perception, mainly predominant in the West, was, okay, these are the commies or ex-commies, and we are the winners. Yes, that could have been the kind of underlying perspective. But in the East, at least Central Europe, yes, Eastern Central, whatever you call it, yes, Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. Well, people see themselves as victims of the post-World War II division of Europe, and you can see that they actually fought hard for their freedom. 56 in Hungary, 68 Czechoslovakia, 81 in Poland, etc. And there are many other revolts. And then there was the difficult transition after this. Yes, so it's not so surprising that there is this kind of tension, East-West tension, and then there is the continuation of the divide in terms of we still talk about new member states, but after 15 years, I mean, why? I mean, and there is all this kind of divides, more subtle or maybe more explicit, less explicit. And also, the countries in this part of the world have been, in some sense, peripheries, maybe colonies. They see, okay, under Moscow, under other capitals, and so there is some kind of skepticism towards say global or local powers, so to say. And this is a mixture on which some politicians, it's not so surprising, they are capitalizing on this kind of tension, on this kind of perceptions, and that's I think is one of the substrates, so to say, for the democratic backsliding, what we currently observe, and that's the challenge for public policy. So now this makes the full circle. So that's the largest challenge I see in Central Europe, but also for Europe. And I could talk about it more, but I stop here because the comment was supposed to be short.
Very briefly.
Yeah, just one point about this, because I think it can add to some of what you have all said now, is this timing of convergence and duration of convergence. I understood you that it was sort of too fast, or it was not too slow, you said. Like the 10, you said in 95, in 2004 it was only EU membership, and that this was too late also, but I didn't.
The transition started in 1989.
Yeah, 89.
This is what I meant.
Yeah.
So,
This is what I mean with enlargement. It starts very early.
Okay, then.
Yeah, the agenda was there, but you are right that it was, at least in our countries, in Austria, it was not at all communicated to the public. I was a student at the time when we were running for EU membership, and I never heard that in the EU there was already the Agenda 2000. I never heard of it, and I was studying economics. So maybe I was not a very attentive student, but for me this was actually an argument against joining the EU for Austria, because I thought that now the Iron Curtain has vanished, and now we turn towards another fortress, sort of building new walls against the East, which was not on the agenda, because in Brussels it was long decided that we wanted to take these countries on board. But it was not communicated for fear of, at least in the Austrian case, that people would vote against the EU because they were afraid of the Eastern European countries studying. I almost voted against because I was afraid that they would not join. But this is a point that we always have this thinking, it's East or West, but we cannot think of any other state. And I think this is a big issue for countries like the Ukraine, because the Ukraine never had a choice to have another position rather than decide for either go under the Western influence or go completely under the Eastern Russian influence. And it's actually, both options are not good. But a good option would be to have either a bridging function or to have some more should be allowed. And I was a bit surprised. You said EU promise to Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay, nothing. Sorry, then I got this wrong. Because But on the other hand, if we give EU promise, like on the Western Balkans, we should probably also keep it, because it's I think, very much agreed that the view on EU integration was really important for all the reforms to be pushed through, for the acceptance also of reforms also. So without this goal or this, it would be even much more difficult, I think.